A few nights ago, this happened to me, and I keep thinking about it. I work in the criminal justice field, where I see a lot of crime, and also I'm naturally a follower of this subreddit, scary movies and scary stories in general. I do have to disclaim that I do have a heightened sense of paranoia sometimes, but my girlfriend and her roommate both agreed that this was weird as well. I was out walking my girlfriend's roommate's dog, as she was working a night shift in their neighborhood. It's a very safe suburb in New York. I walked across the parking lot, and to this little field in the middle of a rotary, or a roundabout, whatever you call them. I lived in Boston for a while, and there they call them rotaries. I was screwing around a little in Reddit since it was near midnight, and in the middle of quarantine, so there were no cars out. The dog has a long leash, so she was sniffing around, when I kind of saw her stop and stare towards the road. I looked up, and in the distance I could see a black SUV stopped in the rotary. I pulled on my COVID mask that was on my chin. Since no one was around, I had it half off, as some people in New York are touchy about that, understandably. I did it just in case they stopped to lecture me, and I didn't care to engage in some dumb argument. I looked back at my phone, and then back up at the SUV that was still there. There was a family inside. Mother, father in the front, and a 12-year-old daughter in the back seat. I was a bit startled, though, because they were all just blankly staring directly at me. I waved a little to them and nodded, and started walking the dog a bit around the grass again. They started to slowly move. They came around the rotary, and I looked back. All of them were again staring directly at me. I figured that maybe they wanted to talk to me, so I stopped and waited for them to get around the circle. But when they approached, they kept driving very slowly, just staring at me directly the whole time. I gave another nervous half-wave as they drove past me, still extremely slowly, and just boring into me, back around the circle, then around once again. Literally all of them were just eyeing me down, even the little girl in the back seat. I put my arms up in a shrugging gesture as if to say, what the fuck? They did this a few more times, and I started to walk up to the edge of the circle to engage. Normally something I wouldn't do, but it was a family, so I sort of felt a bit more brave to do so. They sped up a little bit and went around the corner and turned off the rotary. I started to feel even weirder, so I decided I would walk back to her apartment building when they suddenly entered the rotary again. I was watching them out of the corner of my eye, and they were still just watching me. I started picking up the pace when they turned off the rotary towards me. I kept walking faster as they continued to follow me. Once I got to the sidewalk, I turned around because I didn't want them to know which door I was walking to. It's on a strip mall with a few other apartment buildings and stores. They stopped around 30 feet behind me, and they looked out, staring from the front window. The little girl was now in the center seat, staring at me too. I once again raised my arms. "Can I help you?" There was no response at all from them. I stood there, no movement from either of us. I took my phone back out and typed their license plate into a note app. Again, a weird thing I do, probably from my work in criminal defense and general paranoia. They slowly turned to the other side of the parking lot, never taking their eyes off me, until they got to the end of the lot. I rushed into the apartment building, which luckily needed a code to enter. I got up and told my girlfriend, and then a roomie in the AM. They were both kind of freaked out. I watched them out of her window, and they pulled back up to where I was standing on the sidewalk. They just sat there in the car, staring at where I had been. I couldn't see them at this point, but the roof of their car. It felt like 10 minutes before they finally slowly drove away. I can't stop thinking about their creepy-ass blank stare at me. Somehow it made it even creepier that it seemed to be a normal-looking family with a young daughter. If it was two younger guys, I could have marked it off as they were bored or screwing with me. But this was just blank, unmoving expressions that made it so eerie. Back in 2015, I was working as a live-in home health aide for a wealthy family. It was just me and my patient living in a very nice condo in a quiet neighborhood on a golf course. We were also the youngest people who lived there. I was 27 at the time. My patient was a 21-year-old male with Asperger's, SPD, and BPD, some substance abuse problems as well. He had recently gotten into some trouble and been legally declared incompetent. We'll call him Jake. Jake was a nice kid, but he had severe emotional issues and almost no social awareness, compounded by the refusal to take prescribed medication, which worked incredibly well when he did take it. His drug abuse didn't help either. He was taken advantage of a lot because of the crowd that he hung around with. Right before I moved in, 6 friends came out to hang with Jake one day and ended up staying for 2 weeks and draining his bank account on various drugs, absolutely trashing the place. Jake was a very lonely kid, and he never said no to people. He wanted everybody to like him. Honestly, I think Jake was about 14 to 15 years old mentally. I think he turned to drugs to deal with depression and anxiety, and also to fit in with the people around him. He's much better now, though. It was a very sweet gig. I was paid very well, lived in a nice condo rent-free, and basically I just had to keep our house clean, keep some food in the fridge, and make sure he always took his medication. When I first moved in, my boss, Jake's mother, warned me about a girl who occasionally stayed with her father, who was our downstairs neighbor. She told me that the girl was named Amber. She looked younger, but she was about 37 years old, tall, blonde, and very thin. She was right. She looked a lot younger, like she was only about 25 or so. She said that Amber didn't have a car or a job, and that she was an addict who liked to use Jake. Amber's father had custody of her 2 children, and she would come visit the kids and stay for a few days a week. She said one day Amber asked to borrow Jake's car for an hour, and ended up running off with it for about 2 weeks. She was also the one who introduced Jake to the 6 friends who trashed the condo. She was bad news, and she was never to be allowed in again. She wanted me to call her immediately if Amber ever stopped by, or if Jake went anywhere with her. After the theft, she put a GPS on Jake's car, and allegedly she could stop the engine as well. My boss made it clear that she didn't expect me to be a security guard, just to notify her if things were going on. Leading up to this event, I had a few run-ins with this Amber. I had to politely tell her that things like she was not allowed to come into the apartment, Jake couldn't take her to the store, Jake couldn't go to a party at her boyfriend's house. She was always spaced out. She talked very slow and seemed wide-eyed and just off. She explained to me that she had been hit by a car while riding a bike recently, and complained that she was the one who ended up going to jail. I was very doubtful. Apparently she takes a lot of Xanax and was under the influence. I think that explains the spaced-out part. Anyway, she was never aggressive, but it was clear that she didn't like me at all. She would often say things like, "Jake is his own person. He's a 21-year-old man. He doesn't need your permission." Whenever she spoke to Jake, when we saw her at the gym or in the parking lot, she would always whisper in his ear, no doubt trying to manipulate him into giving her money or something. On to the incident. Jake was out of state with his father, giving me a bit of a mini vacation. My best friend was staying over to spend a few nights with me, and we were drinking PBR and watching RuPaul's Drag Race. It was about 11 p.m., and we hear a light knock at the door. I go to investigate through the peephole, and I see right away that it's Amber. I ignored her. She knocks louder about 30 seconds later. I watched her leave through the peephole and sat back down, telling my friend about the situation. 5 minutes go by, and she's back. This time she's pounding on the door like a cop. I'm getting pissed because I'm off work, and I didn't want to deal with her crazy, especially when my friend was over. I say nothing and go back to the couch. She keeps knocking. She starts yelling through the door, "Hello? Jake? I need help. Hello?" I still don't answer. Then I hear her try to force it open. It's locked. Always, I'm a habitual door locker. This enrages her or something, and she starts screaming and pounding non-stop. I got up and looked through the peephole again. She looked like a demon. Her pupils were huge, so I know she was on something. She looked absolutely crazed. Her hair was tangled and wild. She was sweaty and angry. Looking back, I'll never forget those wide pupils looking at me through an evil glare. I asked her through the door what she wanted. She said she needed to speak to Jake right now. He owed her some money, and she needs a ride to her boyfriend's house right now. I tell her Jake isn't home. She then asks me if I'll take her. I tell her no, that I've been drinking a lot, and that I'm going to bed. She let out a frustrated scream, punched the door a few times, and finally left. My friend and I went to bed shortly thereafter. I didn't hear from her again after that. The next morning, we were getting ready to leave to go to breakfast. I hear a knock like a policeman's knock at the door. You know the sound. I look through the peephole expecting to see Amber, but this time it was an actual cop. I opened my door and I could see the parking lot was crawling with police. There was a van marked crime scene unit and an ambulance. I honestly assumed Amber had overdosed or something. The cop wanted to ask me if I'd heard anything strange last night. I told him about my encounter with Amber, and I asked if she was okay. He told me she was in custody for the murder of her father. He asked me if Jake owned a crossbow and if it was missing. Yes and yes. It had been missing for a few weeks. He said I needed to speak to some detectives at the station. I don't know if she came to my door before or after she murdered her father with a crossbow, like she was Tyrion Lannister or something. But the detective told me that his theory was that she was a heroin addict, and she was withdrawing and needed to get her boyfriends for more dope. She tried to get Jake to drive her, and when that didn't work, she asked her father, who refused. This is what went down. They argued. Other neighbors heard that part. She killed him with a stolen crossbow and stole his truck. She only got about a mile away before she was signaled to pull over. She led the cops in a high-speed chase over the span of 2 counties before she finally lost control and crashed. The cops were only pulling her over on suspicion of drunk driving, but when they went to speak with her, she told them she was speeding because she needed to check on her dad. She thought someone had stabbed him. They asked her why she thought that, and she refused to answer any more. Finally, they sent police for a welfare check, and they found him before her sons did. So that was the time my crazy drug addict neighbor murdered her father with my patient's crossbow. Further below, there's a link. Just look at those eyes. This is a story I've wanted to tell for a long time. Yes, it is very long. It's as long as it needs to be to say what I need to say. This took place between 1995 and 2002. Everyone in their life has had a bad friend or two, and I had an epically bad friend. If it hadn't happened to me, I would have never even known this strange mental disorder was real, or that people could behave this way outside of Lifetime Channel movies. I grew up in northern Indiana. I went to a large high school in the mid-90s, and my senior year I met another student named Hannah. She had recently transferred from the main local Catholic high school in the area. It was unusual for someone to transition so late from private to public school. Hannah said she had been expelled because of a fight with another student over some drama about a boy. She said the other girl had made allegations against her and accused her of attacking her. Whatever had happened, the police had been contacted, and she'd had a restraining order placed on her by the other girl. It had forced her expulsion, and that was how I came to meet her. Hannah said none of it was true, of course. She said she never tried to hurt her at all. Later I went to college in Indiana. She went to college in Florida. One day, a friend of mine from the dorms ran into a guy she had known from Catholic school, back in my hometown. Once he left, she told me about this incident that had happened to him where these 2 girls were fighting over him about which one was his girlfriend. Neither one of them was dating him, and yet both of these girls thought that they were in a secret relationship with him. The whole thing had been very strange. Then she said that one of them was a girl named Hannah. The next summer, I was back in my hometown, and Hannah was as well. I hung out with her casually. I told her what I had heard about her. She said she would tell me sometime what really happened. She had a crush on this boy, but she had seen him talk to another student named Julie, and she became very jealous. She said she was convinced that this boy Mike wanted to be her boyfriend. She was sure Julie must have said something bad about her. Hannah said Julie was popular and pretty, a cheerleader. She hated everything about her, so she decided she would try to see if she could push her to commit suicide. Hannah said that it hadn't worked, but that she had a nervous breakdown. I asked her what she had done. We went back to Hannah's house. Up in her bedroom, she pulled something out from the back of her closet. It was a set of books. One was a book on how to use dirty tricks to get revenge on people, and one was a book with a cartoon character on the front pulling their hair out, and it said in big letters, gaslighting. I know it's a common phrase now, but back in 1995 I had never heard of it. I asked Hannah what the book was about, and she said it was about how to drive someone crazy. She said it was simple. You just make them believe things aren't really true, or that things they think are real never happened. She told me what she had really done to Julie a couple of years back in high school. She had pretended to be friends with her. She got her phone number, and then she had started making these anonymous phone calls to her. This would have been way before cell phones were common. She had a friend from her church who had a crush on her, and she would trade sexual favors with him in exchange for him pretending to be Mike on the phone. He would get a blowjob for every time he did this for Hannah. Fake Mike would tell Julie not to talk in school so they could keep things private. Hannah would put notes on her locker and sign Mike's name to them. Fake Mike would make plans to meet Julie at the mall or the movies and then never show up. It all sounds very stupid, but they would have been about 14 or 15-year-old girls when this happened. Hannah said she had done something really embarrassing, but that it had worked. She had a mixtape, and she would whisper nasty little phrases like, "You want to die," or "You should kill yourself," between songs, and had it played in her bedroom when Julie was over. Obviously, she commented on it, and Hannah sat there with a straight face and said she hadn't heard anything, or had no idea what she was talking about. She had set it up with her brother earlier, and had asked him to help her play a prank on her friend. He came into her bedroom and said he couldn't hear anything and turned around and told Julie she must be crazy. Julie's parents decided to confront this boy and his family about his behavior towards their daughter. He had no idea what was going on, of course, and because her parents had confronted this boy about something he was never doing in the first place, Julie had been publicly humiliated at her high school, and everyone was talking about how crazy she was. Hannah loved every bit of it, until Julie's parents got their phone bill and decided to give it a look. Mike might not have been calling their house, but somebody had been, and they had numerous anonymous phone calls. They checked it out and found they were all coming from Hannah's phone number. Julie confronted Hannah about it at school, and that was when something violent happened between the two of them in the stairwell. Julie said Hannah had started screaming at her that Mike was her secret boyfriend. Hannah was very angry about that. She said Julie made that part up to try and get back at her and embarrass her for what she had done. She said Julie was exaggerating about what had happened in the stairwell, and it had been an accident. She had never tried to push her over the railing. She'd merely bumped into her. Hannah wasn't embarrassed about it at all. She was so proud of it. The only thing that upset her was that she had been caught, but she said that most people at her Catholic school still thought Julie was crazy. She considered it something of a victory. Hannah didn't have anything to say in her defense, just that when she liked a boy, she would do anything to be with them. That summer, Hannah started dating a guy named Derek. Every time I saw her, she told me tales about their wild and crazy sex life, how much he was in love with her. Hannah said it was a secret affair and they were sneaking around behind his girl's back. We saw him once at a party. He screamed at Hannah to stay away from him and leave him and his girl alone. Someone had been making strange anonymous phone calls to him and his girlfriend. He paid to have the number traced back, and found it was Hannah. Hannah admitted that she had been trying to break them up, because he was taking too long to do it himself. She had overplayed it, and now he was angry and had broken things off with her. She was depressed after Derek, so I took her out to a bar. Hannah started flirting with this much older guy in his 40s who was sitting alone by himself. She had recently purchased a cell phone. This would have been about 96 or 97, when they were still kind of new and novel. The next thing I knew, she had this phone out, and I thought she was giving this old guy her phone number. Instead, he asked her what she wanted him to say. She typed a phone number in, and handed the guy her phone. He made disgusting comments to whoever answered about how he was having sex with this guy's girlfriend, and commenting on what a whore she was. He hung up and started laughing, and handed the phone back to Hannah. She gave him a $20 bill, and said the girl was a bitch and deserved it for stealing her boyfriend. She was paying complete strangers to anonymously call people she hated on her cell phone, and recite some prearranged script to spread rumors about them. I ran into a mutual friend later in the summer and had mentioned that Derek had broken things off with Hannah. She gave me a very funny look and said there had never been any relationship to break off in the first place. A year later, we were both temporarily living back with our parents, and sort of adrift. Hannah had been kicked out of her dorm over an accusation made by another student, and never completed her degree. She had started hanging out with some old friends from high school. One of those former high school friends was a young woman named Kelly, who Hannah had been very good friends with. Something had happened between the two of them, because Hannah went on and on about how much she hated her. It had something to do with Kelly's new boyfriend, Dan. Hannah insisted she was using him in some bizarre plot to make another man jealous, and was worried that she would hurt him because she had found out about an STD that she had. I drove by her house one night and there were 2 police cars out front. I went home and called her, and she said she couldn't talk. I went over and saw her the next day. I thought that their house had been robbed or something. No, the police had been there to talk to her about an incident that had been reported. Hannah was upset. She said that she had to tell the police that she had smoked weed and gotten high because Kelly made an accusation against her. Hannah said it was an accident, a misunderstanding. She swore she hadn't been trying to hurt her. The day after Hannah told me about how much she hated Kelly, apparently she had called her up and said she wanted to talk to her about something. She and another friend had shown up, and the 3 of them had gone out to some local overlook to smoke a joint. The other girl waited down below for the 2 of them to talk privately. Hannah had asked Kelly to look at something, and when she turned her back, Kelly said that Hannah grabbed her and tried to push her off the ledge. They were about 100 feet up in the air, and she would have most likely been killed by the fall. Kelly said they fought back and forth. She regained her balance and took off screaming about what Hannah had tried to do. Hannah said it was all a misunderstanding, an accident. She had been trying to show her something but lost her balance because she was high from the marijuana. She said Kelly had almost fallen off because she had hysterically overreacted. Kelly had been very upset and insisted that Hannah had done it on purpose. She was jealous over her relationship with Dan. It was obvious to everyone that Hannah was completely obsessed. What Kelly had not done, however, was tell the police that they had smoked a joint right before this happened. When Hannah did, the police said that they didn't have enough evidence for any kind of case. They weren't happy with Kelly for omitting that part of the account. That was it for Hannah and most of her high school friends. Kelly stuck to her version of what happened, and all of her friends sided with her. People began talking about the strange rumors that had followed Hannah around since high school. I thought it was suspicious, of course, but I couldn't bring myself to believe that she tried to kill another woman. I thought that sort of thing only happened in the movies, not small towns in Indiana. I did not, however, want to be friends with her. She was a complete embarrassment to be around. She had almost no friends left in town at that point. She called me up to tell me she had decided she needed a change. She was going to pursue a different career and move to Minneapolis to make that happen. She moved in 1998. And I honestly thought that I would never see her again. To be honest, I wish I hadn't. She called me up about 1.5 years later. She said she was doing really well, and that the move had been really good for her. She said she'd made some friends, met a boy, and was completely in love. She said this was the guy she was going to marry. His name was Dan, and she told me that he was the guy that had gotten her interested in punk rock and heroin. I kind of paused when she said that. I wasn't any kind of angel in my 20s, but I never even dabbled in hard stuff like that, and it didn't sound very good at all. Hannah insisted it wasn't a habit. She said it was amazing and easy to control as long as you were careful. This was a complete change in lifestyle and scene. Before this, she had been something of a hippie chick, but that was all gone now. At this point, her life revolved around hair, punk rock, heroin, and Dan. and she wanted to come back for a visit. We went to the mall and she stopped at a kiosk and said she wanted to buy a cell phone. She lived 8 hours away in a completely different state, with a completely different area code. We actually got into a small argument about it. Back in 2000, cell phones were purchased and billed from your local area code, and you paid through the nose if you were roaming. Hannah just kept telling me to drop it because she had done her research and it would be fine. She bought the phone and listed her boyfriend Dan as the main user on the registration. She left, and I noticed she had left her curling iron behind. I thought I would surprise her by calling her new cell phone. She had set it up at my house, and I got the number from the caller ID. No one picked up. Instead, it went to an answering machine for Dan. The same Dan that had been dating Kelly years earlier, and the same Dan that Hannah had been accused of being obsessed with. There was no doubt about who it was. I hung up and wondered why she had lied to me about who her boyfriend was. A couple of minutes directly after that, she called me back from her original cell phone. She played it off as some kind of coincidence that I had just called that other number. She said she had run into hometown Dan and his friends and he had lost his phone, so Hannah had done him a favor and given him the one she had just purchased. I said how strange it was that she would buy a phone for her boyfriend Dan, only to run into someone else with the same name and give it away instead. Dan's real name is very common, probably one of the most common names for men of my generation. Hannah joked about how many different people she knew with that exact same name. A couple of months later she called. She wanted to come visit again in the summer. No matter what she said about being in control of the heroin use, it was very obvious that it had become a full-fledged habit. Things had taken a turn in her life. Her boyfriend Dan had moved to Chicago. Hannah said that he was still in love with her, and they were still together, but something had happened with his ex-girlfriend. They were taking a break and only seeing one another privately. Hannah said he was trying to protect her. According to her, his ex-girlfriend had refused to accept their breakup and had been stalking Dan for months, one of the reasons he had moved. She had taken an overdose of heroin and tried to commit suicide when she found out that Hannah and Dan were together. That was the reason they had decided to keep their relationship secret. That was why Hannah was really in town. He was going to be coming later to join her, and they had set up a get-together. I wanted to meet him, but Hannah said he wouldn't act like her boyfriend when other people were around. I started to question her. She got angry, said she wouldn't let me meet him because I wouldn't understand the relationship. We got into a very fierce fight. I ordered her out of my house and made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with her from then on. Her mother called me about a year later. She said Hannah was living with them in Atlanta because something very bad had happened in Minneapolis. Hannah didn't have any friends left at all. Her mother straight up begged me to please forgive her so she could at least have someone to talk to. Hannah had spent 3 months in rehab and was off the heroin but emotionally not doing well. She said she had to make a trip back to Minneapolis to take care of some things and pick up some of her stuff. Her mother was worried that being back there and around her old friends would trigger her wanting to use again. It was very important that Hannah not relapse. If she did, the consequences would be severe. She said she wanted me to go with her, so I said I would. Hannah would never tell me what had happened. She would just say that someone had almost died. It had been an accident, but it had still been her fault. She drove into town to pick me up for our trip to Minneapolis, but said we had to stop somewhere first. We went to the old bar downtown that we used to hang out in when she lived in town. She had wanted to meet someone. Some young woman walked in. Hannah walked over to her and hugged her and started crying. She was apologizing all over the place and kept telling her that she needed her to realize that it had been an accident. She said she forgave her, but that her life had been difficult since what had happened, and she could not have anything to do with Hannah anymore, could no longer be friends with her. Hannah asked if she had ever spoken to her ex-boyfriend and had a chance to work things out with him. She said no. He was mad at her and refused to talk to her. Hannah said he had a new cell phone and gave her the number just in case she changed her mind and wanted to get a hold of him. She left. I was sitting there totally confused by what I had just witnessed. I was really uncomfortable with what I had heard. I asked Hannah if the ex-boyfriend she was talking about was hometown Dan. She said no, it was someone else that I had never met. Hannah said she and her Dan had broken up because he was still using heroin, and it was too painful to talk about him. It was so painful that when we got to Minneapolis, to please never bring him up. She said her friends knew not to mention him around her, and asked me not to as well. We got to Minneapolis, and the young woman we were staying with turned out to be one of Hannah's former roommates. That's when I found out what had really happened, and what Hannah had been refusing to talk about. It turned out that girl from the bar had been the other roommate, the one that almost died because of something Hannah did. We settled in, and Hannah said that she could explain what happened a year ago. A year ago? That was the first time that I realized that this had happened much longer in the past than I thought. The former roommate said that she was happy that Hannah was clean, but she needed her to explain why she had tried to kill the other girl. Those were her words. She wasn't calling it an accident. She said she was there. She saw it, and Hannah had done that to her on purpose. She wanted to know why. This is what she described. Hannah had a friend from Indiana that had broken up with her boyfriend Dan, after Hannah had told her that she found out he was cheating on her and gotten another woman pregnant. Hannah invited her to live with her up in Minneapolis to get away from him and start over. She had no idea that Hannah was a heroin user. She did not like Minneapolis at all. She had experienced a run of bad luck in the couple of weeks she had been there, and even though Hannah kept trying to convince her to stick it out to see if she would like it, she had decided she was going to leave and go back home. She had regretted her breakup with Dan. She wanted to call him and see if they could work through it. They had been together for almost 2 years after all. She was worried because she had lost touch with him. Hannah had been able to track down his phone number for her through some mutual friends, but no matter how many times she called or how much she begged, he refused to answer her calls or call her back when she left messages. She was upset and told Hannah she was going to stop by his apartment to see him on her way back to Indiana. She was supposed to be leaving within a day. Hannah kept insisting that she would love heroin if she would just try a bit, and had been pressuring her very hard to join in with everyone else. The roommate was angry about that. She said Hannah knew she was scared and didn't even want to try it. Hannah had promised her that she would be safe, and promised her that it would be a small dose. She said she knew what she was doing, and she gave in. Hannah bought the heroin and bought a lot more than normal, which she said was for a party later. She prepared the needles and said she had just used a small amount. Instead, she used all that she had bought, which turned out to be way more than necessary to kill all of them. Hannah had given the girl the injection, and she slumped over immediately and stopped breathing. Hannah then moved to the other roommate and told her everything was fine in the other room and that she was enjoying herself. She tried to convince her to take her dose, but she wanted to check on the other girl first. Hannah walked over and had an imaginary conversation with the young woman, who was completely unconscious, trying to convince the other roommate that she was fine. She went in to check on her herself, and immediately saw she wasn't even breathing. She panicked and started screaming about why she was lying. She ran for the phone. Hannah ran after her. She dialed 911. Hannah grabbed the phone and hung it up. They called back and she said it had been a mistake and they were fine. Hannah wouldn't let her near the phone and kept trying to tell her that she was being hysterical and that everything was okay. She tried to pin her down and force the needle on her. She fought back and ran out of the apartment and down the hall to a neighbor's, where they called 911. When the paramedics got there, the girl was clinically dead. They worked on her and got a heartbeat, and transferred her to a local hospital in a comatose state. She lived, thankfully, but for a while it wasn't clear if she would pull through. Hannah told the police she didn't know why she had done it. After talking with a lawyer, she said it was because of heroin psychosis, and that she had been temporarily insane at the time. She agreed to a long-term rehab stay, and a year of drug testing and probation. After that, the charges against her were dropped. That had been the reason that it was so important Hannah did not relapse. She would have been looking at some serious prison time. Hannah said it had been a strange temporary hallucination that had caused her behavior, and that she had never meant to hurt her. The whole thing was an accident and a misunderstanding. The same excuse she always used. I'm going to spell this out, since the morons who work for the Minneapolis Police Department were too stupid to realize this 20 years ago. Hannah was obsessed with this girl's boyfriend Dan. She had been obsessed with him for years. She had developed a detailed and deranged fantasy that the two of them were in a secret relationship together, because she had a peculiar and somewhat rare psychiatric condition called erotomania, or Declermabalt syndrome. She believed that this woman was standing in the way of their romance, so she instigated herself to her and pretended to be her friend. She wanted to find a way to get close enough to her to get her out of the way. She successfully managed to spread rumors and interfere in their relationship enough that the two of them broke up, and then Hannah invited this young woman to Minneapolis to isolate her from her other friends. This was the year 2000. We didn't have text message or Facebook back then for keeping in touch with people. She lulled her into a false sense of friendship and security, so she could manipulate her to get her close enough to her to hurt her. When she realized she was still in love with Dan and wanted to talk to him, Hannah realized she would eventually find out that the rumors she had been told were not true, and that Hannah was the source. She purchased a cell phone in Indiana and made a recording of Dan's answering machine message so that she could impersonate him on the phone. The young woman would believe she was in contact with him. She never even knew that Dan never received any of the messages. Hannah was using that to spy on her. When she said she was going to go back home and show up and see if Dan would talk to her in person, Hannah knew that meant she would find out she had given her a fake phone number. That she had gone to extreme lengths to prevent her from speaking to him, and it would have been obvious as to why. She tried to talk her into trying heroin because she planned on killing her and her other roommate. That would be a good way to make it appear to be an accident. Hannah was about to have her obsessions with Dan, her delusional beliefs about him, and her bizarre mental disorder exposed, and she knew that. She knew for at least a day or more before the accident, which is why it was clear that her actions were premeditated, because her motive was. All this would have been remarkably easy to figure out if the police had contacted Dan, if they had just taken a look at her phone records. Phone harassment has always been her favorite hobby. Instead, they treated it just like the other 99 overdoses they have to respond to every month, and gave Hannah the old rehab or prison option. Since her family could afford a lawyer and a 3-month rehab stay, that was the option she took. The police never investigated her for anything, never contacted the man Dan at the center of this, never took any serious look into her background. It wasn't an accident. It was an attempted murder, and a pretty easy one to prove at that. Instead, the police totally dropped the ball, and because of their incompetence, she was allowed to completely get away with it. By the way, just in case any idiots who work for the Minneapolis Police Department ever read this, there's no statute of limitations on first-degree attempted murder. At the time, I didn't know any of this. I was trying to act as a support system for a former friend, who was suicidal on the cusp of a heroin overdose. I was suspicious, of course, but anytime I asked Hannah questions, she just said it was too painful to talk about, or guilt-trip me into not respecting her boundaries. She had sworn to me that this young woman had never been in any relationship with the Dan from our hometown that she had known years earlier. I returned to Indiana, and Hannah returned to her parents in Atlanta. I didn't talk to her for a while after that. She called later and wanted to visit her own hometown again. Once again, I let her stay with me. This time, though, we ran into Dan. He had moved to Chicago, but just happened to be back in town that weekend. I hadn't seen the man in years. Hannah had contacted him to get together. She spent the whole afternoon trying to pull him aside to talk to him, but he made it clear he had only wanted to show up because he wanted to see me. He had broken up with Kelly years earlier, but I thought he had a long-term girlfriend since then. Dan said she had left him a year ago and just disappeared. He had called her repeatedly, but she had completely cut him off. He was nice to me. He was handsome. He was a lot of fun to be around, and he asked me out. We made plans to meet up the next day. I saw him at a bar and he turned around and walked out the door. He wouldn't even look at me. I was upset and confused. Hannah was super sympathetic. She apologized for not telling me what he was like, and said he had this weird thing about lying to girls and playing with their emotions by pretending to like them. It wasn't like I had never been lied to by a boy before, but this situation felt strange. A week later, my student loan came through, and I decided to go back to college and finish my degree. I moved a couple of hours away. The first person that called me was Hannah. Once again, she wanted to come visit me. She insisted she had gone out and got me a surprise, and needed to give it to me in person. She said she had something really important to talk to me about, and that it would sound weird, but she asked me to promise her that I wouldn't tell anyone she was coming to see me. I humored her. She showed up at my apartment, and when she walked in, the first thing she asked me was if I had told anyone she would be there. At first, I said no. She said she had something for me, and reached into her purse. She paused and said she just wanted to make sure that no one knew she was there. I was frustrated. I kind of offhand said that no one besides my mom and my best friend. Hannah got furious. She was angry I had told anyone else she would be there, and refused to show me what she had brought as a surprise for me. She went and locked it in her glove compartment, because she said she didn't want me to snoop in her stuff and find it. She kept saying she wanted to talk about something, but the time wasn't right. She decided to go home a day early. Then one day, a couple of weeks later, out of the blue, she just showed up on my doorstep one evening. I was on the phone with my best friend, who, by the way, went to the same Catholic high school as Hannah, and while not close friends with her, knew who she was. I was talking to her when I saw Hannah walk up to my front door. It was an 8-hour drive from Atlanta to Indiana. I got up and opened the door. I still had the phone up to my ear. When I opened it, she had her head down and she had one hand inside her purse. I said her name. She looked up at me and pulled something purple from her purse. She saw I was on the phone and swiveled around, put whatever she had been holding in her bag back inside. She was acting very strange. She was shaking and I was worried. I asked her to come inside. At that point, I was convinced she was back on heroin, and that had been the secret she had been trying to talk to me about for months. She said she was upset about a boy and needed to talk to me. She had something that she wanted to show me. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a handgun. It was a purple and black revolver, and I realized from the color that it was what she had pulled from her purse when I had first answered the door. She had been checking to make sure the safety was on, and I was lucky she hadn't accidentally shot me because I had startled her. She said the gun was because she was back on heroin and scared of the part of town she had to go in order to buy it. I didn't know back then, but revolvers don't have safeties. She told me about a musician in Atlanta that she had met. She was frustrated because he had a girlfriend, and she hadn't been able to find a way to get him to pay attention to her. She wanted me to tell her what I had done to Dan so she could use it on this guy. She told me he was still talking about me months later, and she wanted to know why he was still interested even though we hadn't talked since the previous summer. From my point of view, he wasn't. He had ghosted me months earlier. Hannah kept insisting that I must have done something to him. It was like she was implying I had hypnotized him or something ludicrous, and she wanted me to tell her. I clearly explained that I hadn't done anything. He had ignored me and then never returned my phone calls after I tried calling him. She cried and drank for a couple of hours, and then turned around and drove the 8 hours back to Atlanta in the middle of the night. For the record, Hannah was the one who gave me Dan's phone number. After this, something very strange seemed to set in motion. I got a call from an anonymous number, and when I answered it, it was Hannah, who said someone wanted to talk to me. She flipped me over to a 3-way call with someone else. It was Dan's roommate and best friend in Chicago. He started screaming at me, asking why I was playing games with Dan and messing with him. He said he was going out of his mind, and I needed to call him back and stop whatever it was I had been doing to him. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. Dan had never called me, and I had tried to call him, and then we were disconnected. Another anonymous call that was really Hannah with another 3-way call, and a group of boys who started yelling at me, telling me they would kill me for what I had done to Dan. Then another disconnected line before I could ask them what they were even talking about. I called Hannah to find out what was going on. It was the craziest and most disturbing conversation I've ever had with another person. At first, she just kept saying that I had hurt Dan. I couldn't ever talk to him again or have any contact with him. None of it made any sense, since this was about a guy that had refused to even return my phone calls and had ignored me for months. Hannah started getting very upset, kept saying that I knew what I had done. I just wouldn't admit it. She said that Dan hated me and had never wanted anything to do with me, but that I was doing things to make him say that and pretend that he liked me instead of her. I had no idea what the hell was going on. Dan was her secret boyfriend. He was in love with her and had been so for years. She said the two of them had been together since they were teenagers, and that I knew it but was pretending not to. I asked her how she could have been his girlfriend, when I knew of all the other girls he had dated. She started screeching about how those weren't real relationships. He was only pretending to like them. When he talked about them, he was really talking about her, but other people kept doing things to him so that he couldn't tell her directly how he felt. But she just knew. She insisted that he found out ways to let her know, that he was always thinking about her. She said that all of his friends respected their privacy, which is why they would play along when he pretended he was dating some other people. She kept insisting he was in love with her, and no one else. She was sick of people pretending to be her friend and then stabbing her in the back by going after her boyfriend. She said she would not put up with anyone coming between them, and not let anyone hurt him. I was forcing him to forget how he really felt, and that it had hurt him to not be with her. She wouldn't let me hurt him. I realized that she wasn't making any sense, and that she was totally psychotic. I told her never to contact me again, and I hung up. All I could think about was how she had pulled a gun out of her purse the last time she had shown up at my apartment. She had given a fatal overdose of heroin to another woman, and had been accused of another for luring them to an edge and trying to push her off. The one thing we all had in common was Dan. I called the number I had for him. It was disconnected. I thought about that weird situation with the cell phone she had purchased a couple of years earlier. I found that old number in my address book and called it, except this time it wasn't Dan's voice on the answering machine. It was mine. The psycho bitch had made a recording of my voicemail and had put it on a cell phone that she owned. Once I discovered that, everything fell clearly into place. That was what had happened to that girl in Minneapolis. That was why Dan had spent the last several months thinking he was contacting me. There was no relationship with Dan. It was all in Hannah's head, and she was frantically trying to keep other women away from him to protect her fantasy from imploding. She is psychotic. It's a real mental disorder, and it's a fixed delusional belief that another person is secretly in love with you. Not everyone who has it will be violent, but some people unfortunately are. In some cases, other people are used in strange psychotic dramas and vicious smear campaigns that are aimed at trying to rearrange reality so that it conforms with the delusions inside their head. The people that are perceived as standing in their way can be victims of extreme violence. Hannah showed up the next day at my apartment, screaming at me to let her in. I would not, of course, and I was getting ready to call the police. She started crying and saying that Dan had killed himself, and then she walked away, and that was the last time I ever saw her. I spoke to my parents, who told me I had received several phone calls to their house from people letting me know the same thing. I changed my phone number to keep her from contacting me. I contacted the police in Indiana, who said if she showed up again that they could arrest her for felony intimidation, but not for anything she had done months earlier. I contacted the police in Minneapolis, but I knew very little information, only Hannah's name, not when or where it had happened. I asked repeatedly to please be allowed to speak to someone, but the woman on the phone said they weren't interested in talking to me. I moved so she wouldn't know where I lived. I cut myself off from anyone from my hometown who I thought might know her, so nothing could ever get back to her about where I lived. The last I heard from her, she was stalking some new guy down in Atlanta. I would have been more than happy to meet the bitch in a courtroom, but unfortunately the law is nothing like you see on TV. So unless I ever had the privilege of sitting in on her sentencing hearing, Hannah from Indiana, let's not meet. It was a few years back. I was home alone with my daughter, who was basically a newborn. She was asleep in her bassinet beside my bed. I was in my old house, alone as my ex-husband was working nights. My bedroom was on the second floor. It was around midnight when I woke up to give my daughter a bottle. As she settled back to sleep, I laid in bed scrolling on my phone, trying to get tired again. I'm cautious about believing things people post to Facebook without sources, but a few people had made the same post. I stumbled across an article stating that there was a murderer on the run. He had killed a man in the next town over from me and was now running from the police. It said they were advising people to stay inside, lock their doors, and some even received phone calls. Stuff like this was a very rare happening where I lived, so of course I freaked out. I texted my ex-husband at work, who had a hard time believing this, but told me to keep my police scanner on. I fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I was asleep for, but I suddenly woke up because the officers on the scanner were screaming, "Shots fired!" I had a hard time distinguishing what I was hearing on my phone and what was going on outside. Rapid gunfire started, and it sounded like it was right on the street outside my window. It took me a moment to register the noise as shots to my virgin ears, and then it was like time suddenly slowed down. I rolled off my bed and grabbed my daughter. I remember running into the hallway in what seemed like slow motion, blurry tunnel vision with her, away from all the windows and screaming, "What the fuck is happening?" inside my head. I shakily dialed my ex-husband at work. He still wasn't really believing what was going on, so I yelled and called my mom. I just wanted someone to talk to, so I didn't feel so alone and scared. I kept telling her there was a shooting, and I was crying. Maybe she didn't understand me in her half-woke state of mind. I don't even remember what happened after she realized what I was saying, because I was suddenly hanging up and putting the phone on the floor. I stayed in the hallway for I don't know how long, clutching my sleeping baby who somehow slept through all of this chaos. My body was on vibrate. Sometime later, my phone was ringing, and it was my mom. I could barely focus enough to listen, but I thought she told me she was coming over. I told her to stay at home where she was safe. She was yelling at me that she was already on the road, but the police had blocked it off. She told them she was my daughter. I lived on the road, and they let her come. They had shot the suspect. He was dead. When my mom came up to the front porch, we saw wet, muddy footprints coming up the steps and smeared on the door like he had kicked it. I'm wondering if that's maybe what woke me up at first. By the time my mom got to my house and came inside, it was 5 a.m. It was winter, so it was still pitch black dark outside. We sat quietly in the bright kitchen, tiredly sipping coffee and passing my daughter back and forth. My ex-husband arrived home shortly after, and believed everything once he saw all the cops on the road blocked off. Long story short, this man had killed someone in the next town over from me about 3 or 5 minutes away. He ran to my town, through my backyard to the road through the trees, and killed another person in the house in back of me. That's when the cops showed up and he began to shoot at them, so they shot at him, all the gunfire that I heard. He lay dead in a measly patch of woods in back of my house. I had goosebumps thinking about all this murder taking place around me as I lay there in bed. When my mom left, my ex-husband put our daughter back to bed. I stepped outside on the back porch to smoke a cigarette, 8 months smoke-free. I stood there smoking and watching all the lights, a stark contrast against the early gray morning. Cold. That afternoon I ended up having to block multiple news reporters for harassing me to tell my story. I told them I had no problem telling them the story in more detail, but I didn't want to be on television. I had not slept at all, and had my daughter with me. They said they wanted her on camera too. After denying them, they kept asking if I was at work. They could come to my work to do the interview, so I ended up blocking them and moving on with my life.